Okay. So thank you everyone for joining today's Mangrove Restoration Tracker Tool virtual webinar training. This training is hosted by SOM and several partners in the Western Indian Ocean region, where they expressed the need for an additional mangrove restoration tracker tool training as part of a regional initiative. So today we will be providing a general overview of the MRTT as well as the Global Mangrove Watch platform, which hosts the MRTT tool for users. So today it will be a very general overview of both of these tools as well as demonstrations on how to use them. So before we get started, I did initially have an activity planned for the group, but because we had so many participants register, we're just going to go ahead and jump into a background survey to get a better understanding of the mangrove restoration background of all of our participants, where or what their role and affiliations are for mangrove restoration projects, and just to have a little better understanding of the impact of this training today. So on your screen, you should see a link, which should take you to the survey. So if you all could go ahead and go into that link, it should only take about 2 to 3 minutes to fill out the survey, and then we will jump right into the content for the training today. And if you have any questions, feel free to throw them into the Q&A or into the chat. Or you can come off of mute and let me know what your question is. Just put the link in the chat. Hopefully that makes it more accessible to everyone. Give one more minute to complete that survey, and then we will jump into the content of the training today. Okay, I'm going to get started. So, a brief introduction about myself and why I'm hosting this training today. So, I am staff at WWF in the branch in the United States. So, I'm based in Washington, D.C. My name's Lainey Esch. Sorry, I probably should have started with that. And at WWF, I support mangrove and seagrass conservation projects in a technical capacity. And a large part of my role at WWF also sits on the Global Mangrove Alliance, which is a global group of mostly NGOs, but also some academic partners that all share goals related to mangrove conservation efforts. And so within the GMA, I am the point person for education on the Mangrove Restoration Tracker Tool, which is why I am hosting this training for all of you today. And so for the past several months, I've been developing new training materials and rolling all of these trainings out to new users to try and find more practitioners that are interested in adopting use of the Mangrove Restoration Tracker Tool. Okay, so let's get into what the tool actually is, and then we will go through demos of two of the tool platforms. So the target audience for today's training, as well as for the Mangrove Restoration Tracker Tool, are mangrove practitioners. So the people who are actually implementing or managing mangrove restoration projects. To use the tool in an appropriate fashion, you have to have a fairly deep understanding of the data that's collected for mangrove restoration projects and the actual workings on the ground at the site level. And so assuming that covers most of you, you all have great knowledge of why mangroves are so important at the global scale. They store tons of carbon. They are nursery habitats for many juvenile fish and invertebrate species, as well as increasing biodiversity, especially of threatened marine species, as well as providing coastal protection to billions of people worldwide. And this is why it's so important for mangrove habitats to be conserved. And despite knowing all of these benefits, mangroves are critically threatened due to various impacts through time. And so far, we've lost approximately 50% of mangroves at the global scale, and that's led to really devastating impacts for many communities that depend on them for livelihoods and protection. And so there's a great understanding of the need to try and conserve these and restore the mangroves that we have lost through time. And that's why there's been this really huge push globally to try and restore as many mangroves as possible. And that's led to targets at the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, the Global Biodiversity Framework, as well as targets that were set by the Global Mangrove Alliance to restore half of all mangroves that have been lost since 1996, which equals roughly 400,000 hectares. And the goal is to achieve this target by 2030. And so, despite being all of these global goals and global targets for restoring mangroves, there wasn't necessarily an application to record and track progress towards these goals. And so, that's when a group of scientists and researchers recognized the need for the Mangrove Restoration Tracker Tool. So the development of the MRTT was very long and consisted of more than 100 researchers and practitioners that came from different sectors of the mangrove conservation world. And over the span of roughly 2 years, they were able to develop the MRTT through this iterative framework that you can see on your screen. So this included case studies and field trials to try and test the tool and see how it would actually be used by mangrove practitioners and try to make it as user-friendly as possible. So once all of that development happened, the MRTT was finally launched in 2020. However, it is continuously under development. So we are continuing to get feedback from users as they adopt the use of the MRTT and trying to make that as beneficial to mangrove practitioners as possible. So we're always interested in hearing feedback from all of you as you start learning how to use the tool or start implementing it in your mangrove restoration projects. So feel free to reach out to us at any time to provide that feedback or seek answers and support for any questions that you may have. So the MRTT has three main sections. The first is a registration section, which includes information essential for pre-restoration of a mangrove site. And then in the middle is the intervention section. And last but not least is the post-intervention section, which covers post-restoration monitoring. So any data that a group is going out and collecting after the actual restoration intervention has happened. And you can see in this image that each of those three sections has multiple subsections that cover a series of questions covering either the background information about your mangrove restoration site or just storing some of the important information for assessing your project through time. Data can be entered into the MRTT at any point in time. So if you're a new user, but you have historical mangrove restoration data, you can enter that data all at once into the MRTT for your project as a way to store and track your progress. Or if you're just getting started on a mangrove restoration project, you can go ahead and fill out each of these sections as your project progresses. So it's not limited in the time frame of your mangrove restoration project. One component that I wanted to make sure I touched base on today is the number of questions that are in the MRTT. And that's because this is the biggest point of feedback that we get from users, is that it's a very comprehensive tool. It has many questions, a total of 84, which can sound and appear quite daunting, especially to new users. However, I wanted to state that those 84 questions are not all mandatory questions. So even though that sounds like a very long list and a big effort to try and input answers to 84 questions, only 12 of them are mandatory. And so even though it can appear quite intimidating to see all of these questions laid out in front of you, try and remember in the back of your mind that only a very small number of those questions are actually required to put your data into the MRTT and start tracking your mangrove restoration projects. And so that means if there's any questions in the tool that don't necessarily apply to your project or that you don't have information for, you can just go ahead and leave those blank and move on to the next section or the next question within that section. So again, only 12 questions out of the 84 are mandatory, and any information that you don't have, you can just leave blank and skip that question. Next, I want to talk about data sharing. So some of the information that's captured by the MRTT can be considered sensitive information, including in this middle section, the intervention section, where there is a subsection that asks for information related to the cost of your mangrove restoration project. And so anytime that you're answering a section of the MRTT and you would not like that information to be shared with other users, you can go ahead and mark that section as private, in which all of the data that you submit is going to be confidential, and only visible to the admin of the MRTT and would never be used at the project level by the admin. So that covers this first option for data sharing, this private option. Second, you can have a hybrid for data sharing, a hybrid option where some sections might be sensitive and some might not be. So you will display some of that information to other users of the MRTT as publicly available information on your mangrove restoration projects, whereas other sections that you've kept private will not be available. So this captures hybrid data sharing options for your mangrove restoration project. And the last option is to make data fully available to the public, and having all of the information shared to other users of the MRTT, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And this is the option that I prefer because it's going to provide the most sharing of information between mangrove restoration practitioners and provide the most success to future restoration projects, as they have as much background information as necessary to try and be as successful as possible. So why is it beneficial to use the MRTT as an organization? The first is that it's open access and free to all. So it's very accessible to all mangrove practitioners globally, despite any funding limitations. And it's also a centralized location to securely store your data on mangrove restoration projects. So a lot of the times people are using Microsoft Excel sheets to track their mangrove restoration data and have to email files to collaborators on the project. And as practitioners come and go from mangrove restoration projects, some of that information might get lost in that transfer. And therefore, the MRTT acts as a centralized location where users just log in to their platform and they have all of the mangrove restoration data accessible to them at any point in time. And as users come and go, that information is never going to be lost. The second is that it's a collaborative platform that can accommodate restoration projects within organizations across multiple users, or it can also cross organizations. So there's this opportunity to collaborate not only within your own organization, but also with other regional organizations that might be included in your mangrove restoration projects. And the last benefit that I want to discuss is that it's easily downloadable project data, which makes communications and decision making very easy. So if a funder was ever interested in learning about the mangrove restoration that they contributed funds for, you can go ahead and just download the report directly off the MRTT and provide that to the funder without having to make any change or edits to that information. So it's very accessible in that sense as well. I also wanted to note that there is a user guide available, and this is a really comprehensive user guide. It goes through each individual question and addresses any uncertainty that the language in that question might have. It'll tell you the type of question it is and how exactly you should answer that question as a user of the MRTT. And the user guide is available in multiple languages, whereas the MRTT platform is currently only available in English and Spanish, but we do have plans to make that more accessible to people speaking other languages as well in the future. So this user guide can also be found in the Global Mangrove Alliance website. But as we get into the demo and onto the actual platform, I'll also show you where you can find this resource. And then before we get into the demo, I also wanted to note the Global Mangrove Watch platform, which is where we're actually going to start our demo. So the Global Mangrove Watch platform is a spatial platform that holds mangrove data at the global scale. So it has multiple layers of information to share with users on the platform, which I will show you in our demo. And this platform also hosts the MRTT. So the MRTT sits within the Global Mangrove Watch, and all of the information that mangrove practitioners put into the MRTT is displayed on the Global Mangrove Watch platform. So it represents this global repository of mangrove restoration projects at the global scale and helps us calculate our progress and impact towards those national and international targets that I discussed earlier in the training. So not only is it helping us track progress at the global scale, but it's also representing this learning and information exchange among mangrove practitioners to help inform future projects. So as a user, you can go in and kind of see what mangrove restoration projects surrounding your area of interest include to hopefully learn from them and be better successful in your future restoration projects. Okay, so before we get into the demo, I'm going to take a pause here and answer any questions that have come into the Q&A. Or maybe they've all been answered. If anyone has a question, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, or you can go ahead and raise your hand. I saw a couple of hands come up. If you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question, feel free to do that now. Like the only question I'm getting is to reshare the link for the survey into the chat. So I will do that now. And I'm seeing another question asking about the parameters that should be measured during monitoring of mangroves. I think that we will answer this question in the demo. And if I don't address it, please feel free to ask this question again towards the end of the webinar training today. But as we get into the demo, you'll see some of the parameters where you can enter data into the MRTT. And that acts as a really good guide of the information you should be collecting for monitoring. Any other questions? Oh, if you have your hand raised, feel free to go ahead and turn on your mic and ask your question.
Hi, you
Hi,
you can
Jenny.
hear me?
Yes.
Hi. I just a question. As this information is in the platform just for Africa and some nations, how about Latin America? We can use that because I see now in your presentation this is some places there is the projects, but is only we have this or will be in Latin America as well? Let me know.
Thanks for your question, Jenny. Yes, sorry, this image on the slide does not capture the full extent of the platform, but it is a global platform. So no matter where you are in the world, you should be able to access and use both the Global Mangrove Watch platform and the MRTT.
Perfect.
Jorge, did you have a question? Let's get into the demo. So I need to reshare my screen. Okay, so we are going to start our demo with the Global Mangrove Watch platform. And I'm going to share the link for this platform in the chat. So you can follow along on your screen if you'd like, or you can just watch as I go through the demo on the Zoom screen. So when you first pull up the Global Mangrove Watch platform, you're going to see the default screen, which includes a map of the global mangrove extent. So all of the areas that you see in this light blue color represents mangrove extent in that area. And just to go over some of the basics of the platform before we actually get into the data that's stored on the platform and can be used by mangrove practitioners. At the very top left is our navigation menu. So you can see 4 options here that can be really helpful for new users, including this menu that has many links to different resources. So there's an online training available for new users of the Global Mangrove Watch platform. That is open access and free. So feel free to find that in this page. It also has a link to the Global Mangrove Alliance website for more information. And then there is also the link to the Mangrove Restoration Tracker Tool and a contact us link for any questions that you may have about the platform. You can change the language that is displayed on the platform for accommodating hopefully your native language. And then also this help button in the top left where you can ask questions and also turn on a navigation option in which it'll guide you through the platform as a new user and give you a better understanding of how to navigate the Global Mangrove Watch. Just below that menu is the location of interest for the user. So the default is at the global scale. So you'll see that it says the world. However, you can change this to be in your area of interest. So if I was a practitioner in, let's say, Kenya, I could go ahead and type my country in and it'll zoom in to your country of interest and show you information specifically about your area of interest. If I wanted to get even more fine scale than that, I can click this draw area button or upload a shape file of my specific mangrove site. But since I don't have one of those for the region today, I could go ahead and click this draw area button and zoom in to my mangrove restoration site. And I could go ahead and outline the area that I have worked to restore mangroves. And we want to be as specific as possible when drawing this circle. So really outlining your site as best you can. And then the information below is going to update to represent your specific site. So let me go ahead and reset for the sake of showing the information available. Before we get into all of these widgets, which are our information slides or decks in the bottom left-hand corner, I want to go over to the right-hand side here where you can also find zoom control. You can also find the base map settings in which you can, the one that's my favorite is turning on this satellite view where you're actually able to see the land cover in your area of interest with the mangrove extent over top of it. There's the share page where you can share specific information with your collaborators and colleagues. And then you can also zoom to full screen. And then right next to those options is going to be your legend. Okay, so let's get into some of the information that's stored on the platform. So the default, as I mentioned, is going to be mangrove habitat extent. So when you first come onto the Global Mangrove Watch platform, that is going to be represented by this light blue color. And that information will be displayed as the top deck widget. So it'll give you an estimate of the mangrove habitat in the world or your area of interest if you've refined that. You can change the units here. So I like to have mine in hectares. And you can also change the year that you're interested in looking at. So mangrove habitat extent on the Global Mangrove Watch platform goes all the way back to 1996 and then kind of jumps around through time until 2020, which is currently our most recent estimate of mangrove habitat. But this is really great because it gives you a very good baseline of what mangroves looked like in your area of interest prior to a lot of the habitat loss that they've experienced thus far at the global scale. So you can again go all the way back to 1996, see what your mangrove extent was like at that point in time, and then get a more recent estimate up until 2020. There's also this information button on each of the widgets where you can learn more about that specific layer of information and where it came from. So what are the resources that created this layer of information? And most often, it'll provide you a link to a peer-reviewed publication. So this is a really great area to try and find more of the details of each of the data layers. And this mangrove habitat extent layer is also downloadable. So if you're someone who likes to use GIS, you can go ahead and download that mangrove extent layer and play around with it in GIS at your own will. And then at the very bottom of this widget, there's also this option to turn on an even higher resolution mangrove extent layer. So the default is 30 meters, which is very good and comparable to many of the mangrove extent layers that are available at the global scale. And then this high resolution layer zooms in to a 10-meter resolution, so going from 30 to 10. And so when you push this button here, it'll just switch on that layer. So when you zoom in on your map, you should then be able to see this higher resolution layer. I do want to note before we move on to the next widget of information that the Global Mangrove Watch platform will be getting an update in the new year. So in just a month or two, we will have updated mangrove extent that will increase in time to 2024. So there will be a much more updated option to assess the mangrove extent in your area of interest in just a couple months. So although it currently shows 2020, this is going to be more up to date, dating up until 2024. So that can be very useful for any upcoming projects that you might be trying to figure out baseline information for. The next layer I want to show you is the mangrove net change layer. And this one's very relevant for planning restoration projects because it's going to show you where mangroves have been lost through time. And this can allow practitioners to target their restoration projects where mangroves have recently been lost and might give them a better chance of being successful. So just like the mangrove extent layer, this goes from 1996 to 2020, and you can change those years to whichever you are most interested in assessing where mangroves have either been lost or gained through time. And then to turn on that layer and make it visible on the map as a user, you're going to click this button. And then you'll see it added to your legend in the bottom right corner. And if we zoom in, let's say we continue to focus on Kenya. And let's hide our mangrove extent layer because that can sometimes change the appearance. I think this was the area that I outlined. You can start to see these little areas of either red or green, which indicate either gain or loss of mangroves through time. So when you're planning your restoration, you might look over to the east and see that there's a lot more red in this area than there is green. And so when you're trying to plan for restoration, maybe this would be a really great area for you to target and do some more background assessment to determine if that area is appropriate for mangrove restoration or not. Okay, let's turn that one off again. The next one I want to show is called Mangrove Alerts. And mangrove alerts are essentially these alerts of mangrove loss. So when the condition or threshold and color of a mangrove has decreased past a certain threshold, this alert is going to be signaled for an area in which it's alerting that there might be an instance of mangrove loss that practitioners or local stakeholders might be interested in investigating further to see what the cause of that loss was. So if I zoom out to the country scale of Kenya again, and I turn on those mangrove alerts, you're going to see this heat map pop up along the coast where the mangroves are. So the more purple in color is going to represent an area where more mangrove loss alerts have occurred, and the yellow is going to represent fewer mangrove loss alerts. And when we zoom in, we can get a finer resolution of where exactly those loss alerts are happening. So as a local stakeholder, you might be thinking, well, we had a storm that happened in this area recently, so it makes a lot of sense that our mangroves would have been impacted to the point where this alert is detecting loss. Or as a stakeholder, you might be thinking, there's nothing out of the ordinary that's happened in this area recently. And so I want to go and investigate. Maybe there's some illegal activity happening in this area that I'm unaware of and I want to make note of and bring more light to. So as a local stakeholder, you can use these mangrove loss alerts in different ways, but it can be very good for rapid on the ground action for mangrove loss. The one limitation of the mangrove loss alerts is that they are not yet available at the global scale. They only are available, I believe, in 10 countries. So depending on where your area of interest is, you would have to go into the Global Mangrove Watch platform and see if those loss alerts are available in your area. The next layer I want to talk about, because it's very specific for mangrove restoration, which is our topic today, is called the restoration potential layer. So the default widgets or information slides for the Global Mangrove Watch is limited to 7 layers. However, if you click on this widgets deck button that's just below where you would type in your area of interest, you're going to see a whole list of information that's available to users of the Global Mangrove Watch platform. So currently it has those 7 highlighted that are the default layers. However, there might be more that you're interested in viewing for your area of interest. So there's some for outlining protected areas. The Allen Coral Atlas is in this. And then the layer that I wanted to talk about is the mangrove restoration potential and also the mangrove restoration sites. So to turn those on, you just go ahead and click the boxes. The column on the far left will provide you the information in the widget. But if you want to be able to view those layers on the map, you're going to go ahead and also click the check boxes for the column on the right. So I've gone ahead and checked all 4 boxes for those 2 layers that are specific to mangrove restoration. And those should now be viewable both on our map and in our legend, as well as in our widgets deck on the left side. So if I scroll down, I can go ahead and find those widgets of information. So the first one that I want to talk about is the restoration potential layer. And so this layer gives a score for mangrove habitat at the global scale. And it's an indicator of how likely it is that if restoration were to occur, it would be successful. So I want to emphasize that this layer is not suggesting that restoration should happen in any specific area. It's instead saying if you, as a mangrove practitioner, choose to do restoration interventions in this area, this is your score of likely success based on several different things. So again, if we want more information about how this score is generated, we can click that information button and find the resource for the baseline of that information. And if I remember correctly, this is going to assess things like land use, tidal range, sea level rise, and ultimately provide a score for restoration. So if we zoom back into that area in Kenya that I've been focused on for this training, you can go ahead and click on your area of interest and see what the restoration score is. So it's suggesting that the restoration score in this area is 85 out of 100. So that's very good and suggests a high likelihood of success if you're doing proper restoration in this area based on things like land use and changing weather patterns. And so if you want more information, you can click some of the additional boxes here. You can see the assessment of the different parameters for generating those scores, as well as the ecosystem services that would be provided if that habitat were restored. And then the last layer that I want to mention before I get into the questions is called restoration sites. And so this is where the MRTT comes into play. As I mentioned, data that's entered on the MRTT is uploaded into the Global Mangrove Watch platform and can be viewed on the platform. So when you add that widget onto your map, you're going to see these pink dots that pop up, and these are going to represent projects that are in the MRTT. So when you zoom in, you can get a better assessment of how many projects are on the MRTT in your area of interest. So it looks like in Kenya, there's 11 projects currently in the MRTT representing mangrove restoration projects. And when you zoom in, you can get an even more detailed view of where those projects are. And you can also click on each of them and learn more information about the restoration that has happened in that area. So Kenya probably isn't the best example of how that information is represented because a lot of those are from a training workshop. So let me try and find one that has more information. Here we go. So this restoration site in the Maldives, once I click on it, you can see the name of the restoration site, the landscape, the organization that conducted the restoration and put that information into the MRTT. You can see the intervention type that they used for their project, as well as the project aims. So ecological aims, socioeconomic aims, and any community activities that happened. So clicking on any of these restoration projects can really provide a good understanding for organizations that you could collaborate with on mangrove restoration projects. It'll tell you the intervention types that a lot of different organizations are using in your area of interest. And if you're interested in learning even more about a specific restoration project, you can reach out to that organization directly and hopefully get more information to help inform your future mangrove restoration project. So hopefully learning things about, were they successful? What were the challenges that they faced? And help make your project as successful as possible by relating to other projects in your area of interest. Okay, I see that we have questions, so I'm going to go ahead and start answering those. If you have any questions that I don't answer or haven't answered yet, please feel free to throw them into the Q&A. And then after I answer those questions, we will get into the demo of the MRTT. Okay, what is the accuracy of the data? So the accuracy varies by layer of information. The global mangrove extent layer is 92% accurate. And if you are a data person, you will have a good understanding of some of the limitations of global data layers. So when you zoom in to the site level or a more fine scale resolution of that data, you're going to lose accuracy. So the accuracy is really represented at the global scale of 92%. And when you zoom in at a more fine scale, you're going to start to lose some of that accuracy. And again, if you're interested in learning more information about this, there are publications about the Global Mangrove Watch platform and the information that is stored within. And again, you can find that in the information bubbles for each of the data layers. I see some people asking for the PowerPoint after the training. I'm happy to share it with all of the people that registered today. The next question is about privacy of data and accessibility. Um, so we'll get into this more when we go into the demo of the MRTT. There are some questions that are mandatory and will automatically be displayed in the Global Mangrove Watch platform. Excuse me. And this is some of the basic site registration information. So things like your site name, the organization, and I believe the area of your restoration are the four aspects of your project that are automatically going to be displayed on the Global Mangrove Watch platform, and you cannot opt out of that. And this allows us to have some mechanism of accountability. So having your organization's name is going to promote this sense of accountability where you want to make sure that the information you're displaying to other people is as accurate as possible. And also so that other people can reach out to your organization if they were interested in learning more about your restoration projects. But we'll get in and I will show you a little bit more in the MRTT how you can make specific sections public or private, depending on the sensitivity of the information within that section. Do the mangrove restoration managers have to input their credentials? The only credential that we currently require is that representation of your organization. And then we're also undergoing a new process of QA/QC, where we are, as admin of the Global Mangrove Watch platform and MRTT, we are assessing all of the projects that have been put into the platform and determining whether or not we think those projects are valid or not, and requesting more information from the users and people who input information for that specific project if we think that there needs to be more information to validate it. So there is kind of this new QA/QC process that's just being started and will continue to carry on through time to make sure that the information that's represented on the Global Mangrove Watch platform is legitimate. Does the baseline data of mangrove cover gained from satellites use any kind of ground truthing? So no, the global mangrove cover layer does not have any ground truthing. And as I mentioned, does decrease in accuracy as you get down to that more fine scale, like the site level. However, we do also allow organizations to submit their own data on mangrove cover. And this is what's called a national dashboard. And I think we actually have some that were submitted by some in Kenya. So let me show you what that looks like. So if I type in Kenya again as my country of interest in the Global Mangrove Watch platform, one of the first things that pops up in the widgets is called the National Dashboard. So you can see that Save Our Mangroves Now submitted mangrove extent data from the year of 2020. And you can see that information displayed on the map. And that information, we hope, is going to be more accurate at the country level than what the global mangrove extent layer is. So you can go ahead and turn that layer on, and it will be visible. Unfortunately, the color here is yellow, but you can see it. So this is the data that Save Our Mangroves Now submitted, where you can see mangrove extent and use more of the country level information for your assessment. But again, this data has to be submitted by organizations within their country. And it has to go through a vetting process by the admin. So making sure that it checks the correct boxes to be displayed on the Global Mangrove Watch platform. But as long as it passes all of those checks, we're happy to display it on the platform and make it more accessible to practitioners in their area of interest and provide some of the same assessments that we do for the global layer. Got a question about the size of the projects using the draw area tool. This feature should work for all project sizes. Let me check. I can try a smaller site and see. If it's not working, it's likely just a bug that needs to be fixed, and I can make note of it, but let me try and see if I have the same issue. So I'm getting that it is calculating the size of the area, and it's suggesting the mangrove cover was 2.2 hectares. See if that changes. Delete it and try and draw something bigger. Yeah, so I'm seeing that there must be a bug because it's not calculating the percentage of mangrove coastline historically. However, it is giving an estimate of the area of mangroves in the phrase above that. So this must be a technical bug, and I will make note of it and get our development team to fixing it. But this should be able to accommodate project sizes as small as what's realistic to a project, so less than a hectare, and provide some initial calculations based on your project size. There's some more questions about the data sources, which I'm not going to deep dive into during this call, but you are welcome to explore more of the background information as needed. So again, you just go ahead and click on this information bubble, and it will tell you all of the information that was sourced or used to create these different data layers. So whether that's satellite imagery, on the ground work that's happened, whatever it might be, it's going to provide you that information and tell you how exactly the Global Mangrove Watch team generated each of these data layers. Some questions about information in the MRTT. Is there any way to measure the effectiveness of the restoration? And if restoration uses the existing species? So these are questions that are on the MRTT, but I don't think are yet displayed on the Global Mangrove Watch platform. But I will show you where those instances are in the actual MRTT when we get into that demo. A question about any limitations of the mangrove restoration potential layer. So the mangrove restoration potential layer is at a resolution of, let's say you're looking at, you're interested in restoring area that sits along a delta. The mangrove restoration potential layer is going to be at the scale of that entire delta. It's not going to be site specific. So if I turn that layer on again and I zoom into Kenya, where I was prior, if you hover your mouse over your area of interest, you'll see the color change, and that's going to highlight where that score was generated for. So you can see that in this area, it's that entire coastline of the delta that has the same restoration score from this data layer. So that is one of the limitations, is that this isn't going to be a site-specific restoration score, and local knowledge is always going to be the best indicator of whether or not restoration is likely to be successful in an area. How often is the information on the platform updated, and what is the methodology? The information on the platform is updated not spontaneously, but at a scale that makes sense for the effort that it takes to update this. So the mangrove habitat extent layers are updated roughly every 3 to 4 years. We do an update to bring more relevant information, making it as recent as possible for users of the platform. The mangrove loss alerts are updated monthly. So that the goal of those loss alerts is to provide as instant data as possible to local stakeholders to assess the loss of their mangroves. So those happen at a much smaller time scale in terms of updating those mangrove loss alerts. And the other ones, again, kind of vary. Where it's about every 3 to 4 years, because it's a very big undertaking to try and update those through satellite imagery. But again, there is going to be an update at the beginning of next year where you can have more up-to-date information about mangrove extent and the gains and loss in your area through time. And then another question about the methodology. Again, go to that information bubble. And it should provide you all of the methods that were used to generate those data layers. Okay. I got through all of them. If you have any more, please feel free to throw them into the Q&A. And those can start to build up again as I demo the Mangrove Restoration Tracker Tool. Okay. So to get to the Mangrove Restoration Tracker Tool, if you go into the top left corner of the Global Mangrove Watch platform and click on Menu, it's going to provide you a link to go directly to the MRTT. And it should bring you to the landing page that looks like this. So it's going to give you some basic information about what the MRTT is, and then it's going to ask you to sign up or log in. And then in the top right corner, there is this similar menu where it provides you more resources about what the MRTT is. It directs you to the user guide that I talked about, which gives step-by-step instructions on how to fill out the MRTT. And then it also has contact information. So if you want to reach out to us because you're having issues or um, need some support, please fill out this contact us form. And the user guide link isn't working for some reason, but I can throw a link to that in the chat as well. And then again, the MRTT is available both in English and Spanish. And then you will go in and create your account. But for me, I'm just going to sign in. And the page that the MRTT will bring you to when you log in for the first time is this organization page. So if it's your first time in the MRTT or potentially the first time for anyone in your specific organization to use the MRTT, you're going to have to create a new org. So you can see this long list of organizations that are already using the tool or testing the tool. You'll go ahead and push this new org button, and you can go ahead and put in your organization. And one important thing to note here is that only one person from your organization should create the new organization. And once that centralized person has created your organization, you can then add users. And this is what facilitates collaboration. So if multiple people in your organization and on your team are all managing mangrove restoration projects or implementing mangrove restoration projects, you want to be able to collaborate and edit the information that's on the MRTT together. And so this is going to be the way to do that. So once all of the necessary people have their login information, you can go ahead and add them as a new user by inputting their email address and either giving them user admin or admin access to that organization. And so I highly recommend having multiple admin for each organization so that multiple people have full access to the platform. That way, if there's any transition in staff or collaborators on projects, multiple people have access to all of the information within. Okay, so once you've created your organization and gotten all of your collaborators within your organization into the MRTT, you can go ahead and start putting in your project level information. So the first step to doing that is going over to this left-hand panel or menu and choosing the landscapes panel. And you're going to click New Landscape and type in your landscape name. And then choose your organization. And then once you've created your landscape, you can go ahead and create your site. So again, you'll go to the Sites panel in the left-hand menu and choose your site name. You'll use the landscape that you just created, which I can't find, of course. Here it is at the very bottom. And then the next thing that you have to choose is your data privacy setting. And so this is your default data privacy setting and does not determine the privacy. It's not the final decision of privacy for each of your sections in the MRTT. You can always change this for each of the sections once you're actually putting the data into the platform. So I always keep this as public as the default, and then if needed, I can switch it to private for certain sections. So once you have all of that basic site information created, you can go ahead and push submit, and you will have your new site. Of course, I have this long list because I'm admin, but if you click into your site, this is going to bring you to the overview page for your site. And it's going to show you each of the 3 sections of the MRTT and all of their subsections as well. So to start, we have the registration section, which includes all of the background information of your restoration site. The next section is the intervention section, which has 2 subsections, site interventions and costs. And then the last section is the monitoring section. And when you click on the Add Monitoring section button, you're going to see 3 options for monitoring. So you can monitor the management, the socioeconomic and governance status, as well as ecological status and outcomes. So there's 3 options there for post-intervention monitoring with information to include for each of those. So the first place you're going to go is to the site details and location. So this is the first set of questions for projects in the MRTT. And this is the only section that has to be public to viewers in the Global Mangrove Watch platform. So you're going to see that when you click into this site details and location section, that the privacy option is actually grayed out. And it's going to always be publicly available. So you don't have the option of changing this to private in the drop-down menu. So when someone in the Global Mangrove Watch platform goes and looks at your restoration project, this is the bare minimum amount of information that they will see. So you'll choose your start date for your restoration project. If you have an end date, you can go ahead and push yes, and that's going to generate a new question that's asking what the end date is. So I'll put a month from now. The next question asks which country or countries your restoration site is located in. So I'll stick with Kenya as my example area. And then it's going to ask you what the overall site area is. So this is where you're either going to draw a polygon of your site using the map in the MRTT platform, or you can upload your own KML and shapefile of your site. So if you use a GPS in the field and you track the specific boundary of your restoration site, you can go ahead and upload that here. If you typically use Google Earth to track your polygons, you can go ahead and upload a Google Earth file here. Whatever way is going to be easiest for you. But since I don't have either of those, I'm going to go ahead and zoom into my restoration area and draw my polygon. And it should generate your site area at the very bottom. And then you are ready to move on to the next section. So you can go ahead and push save. And then I typically like to return to the site overview before going to the next section, just so that I can see what's left. And then I would go ahead and move to the background next, which is asking more questions about land tenure status, who manages the restoration site that you're interested, trying to gain as much background information as possible prior to restoration. And now you can see that each of the sections is going to give you this option for changing the privacy of that section. So again, the first section, looking at site details and location, has to be public, and this option is grayed out. But now that we're into the next section, we can go ahead and choose whether or not we want the answers to this question to be public or private, depending on the sensitivity of that information. And so when you're scrolling through a section, again, you're going to see that there are a lot of questions, but just a reminder that very few of these are actually mandatory. So you can see that question 2.1 is mandatory because it has this little asterisk, this little star next to the question. And that question is the only required question of this entire section. So if you don't have information for the remaining questions in this section, you can just go ahead and skip it. Or if it's not relevant to your project, just go ahead and skip it. All you have to do is answer that first one to be able to move on to the next section. So after doing that, you can just go ahead and go through each of the different sections. The next one is asking about the aims of your restoration project. We're assessing the causes of decline. We also have this option for a pre-restoration site assessment, which is always suggested. So actually going to the site and trying to understand more about the ecology of your site to best inform your restoration intervention. So does your site need a hydrological restoration? Does it need a change in elevation? Do you just need to clean up some debris that's found at that site? This pre-restoration assessment is going to act kind of like a guide for determining what intervention type is going to be best suited for your restoration project. So I encourage all users to use this as much as possible. If you're not able to get to your restoration site to actually collect on the ground data, you can use remote site assessment. So question 5.3 asks, was the site assessed before the current project was started? Click yes. You have this option of either a field assessment or a remote assessment. So if you don't have the option of going into the field, you can always do a remote assessment where you can use resources and tools like the Global Mangrove Watch platform to assess whether or not restoration is appropriate for your site of interest. So we want to check things like, were there mangroves there historically? Is it a new ecosystem type that we don't want to encourage mangroves to inhabit any longer? What is the reason for loss in an area? Is it a protected area, which is going to facilitate more restoration success because there's this level of protection post-restoration intervention? So even if your site is not accessible because you either, work and live far away from your site, or you don't have the resources to go to this location, you can always do a bare minimum remote assessment to see if restoration is appropriate for your site of interest. And once you've entered in all the mandatory questions for those 5 sections that I just went through, you've completed the first section, the registration section for the MRTT, and then you can start moving into the actual intervention section. And one thing I want to point out in the site intervention section is that it provides you this long list in question 6.2 of all of the restoration interventions that are possible and occur at the global scale. So currently, mangrove restoration projects are so focused on planting, but that is often not the best restoration intervention to happen in many of these areas. And so if you're trying to think about what restoration intervention type is best for your site, based on its ecology, based on its land tenure and management, you can come to this question 6.2 and kind of see all of your intervention options and line that up with what you're seeing at your site to provide you with the most success in your restoration activities. So I don't want people to be thinking that planting is the only option, because we have this long list of interventions that are possible for restoration and align with the best practices for mangrove restoration. The next site in the intervention section is the cost. This is the section that I would say the majority of users of the MRTT choose to be private. And this is because there's going to be maybe some information or phrases and contracts with funders and various other resources that might make users question whether or not that can be publicly shared. So I would say that the majority of our users choose for this section to be kept private. But if you do have the option to make it public, that is very informative information. So there's very limited knowledge of what it costs to conduct mangrove restoration at many areas and regions throughout the world. And so if we can provide better information, that might be very helpful in trying to find funding and achieve our mangrove restoration targets at the global scale. And then the last section, as I mentioned, is the monitoring section, and you can choose between management, socioeconomic and governance status, or ecological monitoring. I would say ecological monitoring is probably the post-intervention type that happens the most. And this is where you're going to be able to put in information about how successful your restoration project was, and more parameters like what is the water quality like there now, what mangrove species are present or did you restore in that area. And so this is going to provide an area for a lot of that fine scale site level information that you collect in the field to be put in and tracked through time to assess the success of your mangrove restoration project. And then the last thing I want to highlight before I open this up for questions is that once you've put in your information into the MRTT, you can download your information as a report. And so again, if your funder is requesting information about your mangrove restoration project and you don't want to have to go in and refill all of this information in a format that's good for funders, you can just go ahead and download this as a PDF report, and they're going to have all of the information that's needed for those communications. So this is a really great tool to store and keep track of all of your restoration projects and provide those communications to your funders. And I think that's all I wanted to touch base on. So I will open the floor up for questions again, and I'm happy to dive deeper into the tool if anyone has more specific questions, or also go back to the Global Mangrove Watch platform and answer any questions that might have come up for that platform as well. So feel free to throw your questions into the Q&A. All right, the first question, how long will the data be stored in the MRTT? I want to say forever. I don't know that that's totally true, but we do have a long-term funding source for the MRTT and anticipate that even if for whatever reason we ran out of funding, we would still be able to store the information that's already in the tool. So this can be considered your long-term storage for your mangrove restoration data. And again, can be that really great centralized location for both yourself and collaborators to see your restoration project level information. And one thing that I didn't get to mention is that you can download reports for both the site level, the project level information, but you can also download organization-wide data. So if you go back to this organization menu on the left-hand side of the MRTT, within your organization, you're going to see this download data option in which you can download all of the mangrove restoration project level information across your organization for storage as well. So if, your organization decided they wanted to switch however they were reporting and tracking their information, you can just go ahead and do a bulk download of all of that data that you have into the MRTT and put it in your own computer files for backup or, whatever it might be. I see a question about accessibility. The MRTT is designed for mangrove practitioners. So again, whoever is using this tool needs to have a fairly deep understanding of the mangrove restoration project and the site in which that project is happening, because you're being asked questions about land tenure and management and water quality parameters. And so whoever's using the MRTT really does need to have a very good understanding of restoration and their own organization's projects. And again, this was designed for mangrove practitioners specifically. The data is stored in the cloud. I have a question about the benefits of uploading your restoration project on the MRTT. So there's a few benefits that I discussed earlier in the training. The first is that this is an open access platform. So there is no cost associated with using it. Anybody can have access as long as they have an internet connection and can log in and sign up for the tool. And it's a centralized location. So if you have collaborators within your organization and across organizations, you all can collaborate on the same restoration project despite being in different organizations. So everybody can be granted access to a project and input their own data. So if you have an on-the-ground stakeholder that's actually implementing the work and maybe collecting some of the ecological information for your project, you can give them access. And you can enter as much information as possible about some of the land tenure and maybe some of the management and funding, the background information for the actual project. And then your on-the-ground implementer can go in and add in all of the water quality parameters that they collected, all of the pre-restoration site assessment questions. So you can really use this as a collaborative space. Another benefit of using the MRTT is that it's acting as this global repository of mangrove restoration. So when you put in your project level information, that's automatically going to be uploaded into the Global Mangrove Watch platform, and other people are going to be able to see that your organization is doing restoration in your specific area of interest and is able to learn some information about your actual restoration projects. So it's really acting as this learning exchange with the goal of informing future restoration projects to be as successful as possible. So when we are doing some of these trainings, we suggest people, even if your mangrove restoration project was a complete failure and you did not have any survival of your mangroves in your area, that project still has very insightful information to learn from. And so, although it might be a failure in terms of the survival of those mangroves, other people in your area can learn from you. Was it the intervention type that didn't work for that project? Was the, sea level rise too much for the mangroves in that area? And so it's just actually not a suitable area for mangroves to live any longer. And so it can be very informative, both successful restoration projects and unsuccessful restoration projects, because it's going to promote this really great learning exchange for mangrove restoration practitioners. What happens if two different organizations create overlapping sites? I think that this is totally possible, right? Because mangrove restoration sometimes doubles up at sites. Like, let's say one restoration intervention was unsuccessful, and so another group has come into the same site and attempted different restoration interventions in that area. And that's totally reasonable that two sites would be overlapping. And on the Global Mangrove Watch platform, those would just sit side by side. There any other questions? Okay, I'm going to throw my contact information on the screen, as well as my colleague, Tom Worthington. Let's make sure that you can see that. Feel free to reach out to us if you and your organization would like any further support in adopting use of the MRTT or have any other questions for us to address. We are happy to try and support you as best we can. Again, if you have any feedback about the MRTT and ways for us to improve the friendliness of the tool, we are always happy to hear and learn about your feedback and try and make the tool as best as possible and as user-friendly as possible. So please share that information with us. I see a couple of people have their hands raised. Let me provide them the ability to talk.
Hi. Um, Thank you. I would like to understand how these information are being collected at the community level, like which tools are being used, whether the digital ones or the paper-based, and that these tools user-friendly for the community members to record the information, as we know that the local communities are the ones who are doing daily monitoring of these restoration activities. Thank you.
Yes. Yes, so I'll reiterate that this tool, the MRTT, was designed for the practitioner. However, there is the ability for the communities to join in on these projects. If they have their own organization that they want to create in the MRTT, they are free to do that and become collaborators on projects. Alternatively, if you know technology is more of a challenge in their area and they don't have Wi-Fi, they can share that information with their collaborators who can input the data for them. But again, the Wi-Fi is the only thing currently necessary to be able to use the MRTT. So as long as they are able to access it, I would think it would be totally reasonable for them to collaborate and contribute information in at the project level. Mhm. See a question in the chat about investments at the site level. The MRTT does have a question asking about the cost of restoration at your site. As when we were overviewing the tool and going through that section, I did make note that this is often a section that MRTT users keep as private because it contains more sensitive information. If you and your funding source has the ability to share that information publicly, that's super helpful. That is an area of limited knowledge at the global scale currently. And so trying to estimate the cost of restoration is very challenging. So currently we don't have the best synthesis of investments for mangrove restoration at the global scale, but that is something that we aim and hope to capture in information from the MRTT. Any other questions? I see that there's one more raised hand. I've given them permission on Zoom to ask it, but they don't seem to be coming off mute. Okay, awesome. I will be sending a follow-up email to all of you that filled out the survey that was presented earlier in the training. And it'll have some resources for support on both the Global Mangrove Watch platform and the MRTT platform to help guide you through the early stages of use. And again, if you have any other questions or needs in terms of support, feel free to reach out to me at my email address on the screen. And I really appreciate all of you joining in today and having such great questions and really being interested and engaged in both of these tools that are hosted by the Global Mangrove Alliance. So thank you all for attending today, and I look forward to working with you.